Has life beaten you down in the last 2 years or maybe even longer? Well, if so, then you're not alone. There was one study released in 2021 that showed that anxiety depressive orders pre-pandemic, that's 2019, were about 11% of the population. That same study showed that in January of 2021, those anxiety depressive disorders had risen to 41% of the population. That's a staggering number. It also showed that young adults were particularly hard hit. The incidence of anxiety depressive orders was highest among the youngest group surveyed, that was 18 to 24, at again a staggering 56%. That's more than half. And those on the front lines, well, the rate of anxiety, depressive disorders, and substance abuse, and contemplating suicide, that was for whoever's classified as essential workers, that was like 12 to 14% higher than the rest of the population. The world is broken, and people are beaten down and worn out. Can you relate to that feeling? I can. Some days I'm just tired. And other times I'm just looking at issues and trying to solve problems that don't seem to have any solution and that I'm powerless to do anything about. How about you? Where do you feel weak? Where do you feel helpless? Where do you feel powerless? That's not really good space, is it? But here's the good news. Jesus isn't weak. Jesus isn't helpless. Jesus isn't powerless. And Jesus is here to help us, and actually to give us someone to lean into when we're in those weak and helpless and powerless places in our lives. In the events that we're going to look at in this conversation, ones that Luke records in chapter 8 of his book, if you want to follow along, we're going to see that Jesus is the mighty one. Jesus controls the uncontrollable, and Jesus defeats the undefeatable. And Jesus brings hope and help to what look like hopeless and helpless situations, not just in general, but where weak and helpless and powerless people need it most. So let's dig in.
One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and left. As they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. A storm came down on the lake. It was so bad that the boat was about to sink. They were in great danger. The disciples went and woke Jesus up. They said, Master, we're going to drown." He got up and ordered the wind and the huge waves to stop. The storm quieted down. It was completely calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. They were amazed and full of fear. They asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the waves, and they obey him."
So who can control the weather? I mean, even with all our technology, we still have a hard time even predicting it accurately enough. We certainly can't control it. The weather's going to do what the weather's going to do. Sometimes when it's strong enough, it destroys things and kills people. Sometimes destroys a lot of things and kills a lot of people, but you can't really stop it, can you? Again, the weather's going to do what the weather's going to do. Now, some of Jesus' friends were fairly used to storms, at least the ones who were fishermen were. That was part of their job. It came with the territory. Before meeting Jesus, they worked the Sea of Galilee where strong winds could come down. It's kind of like our Santa Anas and really stir things up on that shallow Sea of Galilee and make some pretty big waves for the pretty small craft that they had. So they'd seen it before, and they'd survived it before, but this time it's a little bit different. Nothing that they're doing is working. The boat's still floundering and taking on water, and they're bailing and they're bailing and they're bailing, but they're still taking on water. And they're scared. I mean, they're scared, really scared. They think maybe this time, this storm's the end of them. There's nothing more they can do, right? Because the weather's going to do what the weather's going to do. No one can control the weather. And then they remembered Jesus in the back of the boat. And they'd already seen Jesus do miracles, right? I mean, heal people and stuff. So maybe, well, I mean, the weather's going to do what the weather's going to do, but nothing we're doing here is working, so maybe we can wake Jesus, maybe, and he can say, or at least do something, at least pick up a bucket and help us bail, and maybe make it a little calmer than it was. So they wake him up. And then this happens. Let me take you back to verse 24. He got up and ordered the wind and the huge waves to stop. The storm quieted down. It was completely calm. So the weather's going to do what the weather's going to do until and unless Jesus tells it to do something different. I guess the wind and the waves still know his voice. And I'm going to zero in on those words here, completely calm. You see, because in nature, winds can die down pretty quickly, almost like that, and then they're just gone. But once waves get started, it's simple physics. And physics says that these waves keep going even after the winds stop. That's why here in San Diego, if there's a big storm up in Alaska, we can get big surfing down here because the waves just keep going. But here, everything stopped immediately. I mean, just like that. So what does that tell you? That both the wind and the waves stopped immediately. Well, it says that we're in miracle territory here. I mean, if just the wind stopped, the disciples could have chalked it up to some natural phenomena. But when the waves were immediately completely calm, we're in miracle territory here. In fact, you recognize that. They seem to understand that. Verse 25 says they were amazed and full of fear. They ask one another, who is this? He commands even the winds and the waves, and they obey him. And the thrust of the words there is not so much scared stiff, but it's more like, take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. Jesus is the mighty one, controlling the uncontrollable and defeating the undefeatable. And he ain't seen nothing yet.
Jesus and his disciples sailed to the area of the Gerasenes across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped on shore, he was met by a man from the town. The man was controlled by demons. For a long time he had not worn clothes or lived in a house. He lived in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet. He shouted at the top of his voice, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God, what do you want with me? I beg you, don't hurt me." This was because Jesus had commanded the evil spirit to come out of the man. Many times the spirit had taken hold of him. The man's hands and feet were chained and he was kept under guard. But he had broken his chains. And then the demon had forced him to go out into lonely places in the countryside. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged Jesus again and again not to order them to go into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he allowed it. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs. Then the herd rushed down the steep bank. They ran into the lake and drowned. Those who were tending the pigs saw what had happened. They ran off and reported it in the town and the countryside. The people went out to see what was happening. Then they came to Jesus. They found the man who was now free of the demons. He was sitting at Jesus' feet. He was dressed and thinking clearly. All of this made the people afraid. Those who had seen it told the others how the man who had been controlled by demons was now healed.
Now this is a scary guy. Right? First of all, it's in the region of the Gerasenes, and that's Gentile territory. All right, and to good Jews, they didn't even venture there if they could help it. Gentile territory, especially when you had to cross the sea to get there, it was the dark side. And nothing good happens on the dark side territory, or so people thought. Jesus goes there anyway. Jesus isn't scared of the dark side. The disciples are, but Jesus isn't. And then the first thing that happens when they get to the dark side, just after getting through this storm that they only got through because Jesus said stop and it stopped, was they get met by some wild man. I mean, here's a demon-possessed guy who ran around the country naked and lived in the cemetery. And demon-possessed not just by one demon, but by many demons. This is like Exorcist scary times 10, or maybe times 100. And the people in the area tried to keep him safe from himself and tried to keep themselves safe from him by chaining him up. But this guy just kept breaking the chains. He breaks chains. Now, would you go and meet this guy? I wouldn't. I'd go the other way. But not Jesus. Jesus isn't scared. Right? And without even being asked, he tells those demons to get out of that guy, and they do. The man is completely healed. Jesus is the mighty one. Just like the storm, snap, like that, the man is better. I mean, again, listen to what Luke records. The people went out to see what had happened, and then they came to Jesus and they found the man who was now free of demons. He was sitting at Jesus' feet. He was dressed and thinking clearly. Jesus is the mighty one, controlling the uncontrollable, defeating the undefeatable. And you ain't seen nothing yet.
When Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him. They were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus came. He was a synagogue leader. He fell at Jesus' feet and begged Jesus to come to his house. His only daughter was dying. She was about 12 years old. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. A woman was there who had a sickness that made her bleed. Her sickness had lasted for 12 years. No one could heal her. She came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his clothes. Right away, her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. Everyone said they didn't do it. Then Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pushing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know the power has gone out from me." The woman realized that people would notice her. Shaking with fear, she came and fell at his feet. In front of everyone, she told why she had touched him. She also told how she had been healed in an instant. Then he said to her, "Dear woman, your faith has healed you. Go in peace."
Here's a little background on the woman's issue. It's a long-term medical problem. She'd been to doctor after doctor after doctor, and still after 12 years, the issue persisted. Now, Mark records this incident too, and he tells us that in the pursuit of her healing, she'd gone bankrupt, pretty much spent everything that she had. And still, after all those years and all those doctors and all that money, nobody could help. And then Jesus came to town. Now, there was a pretty common superstition at that day that the power of a person, what they called the person's aura, extended to their clothes. And that's why the woman's just there trying to sort of sneak through the crowd and touch the fringe of Jesus' robe and then blend back into anonymity, because she wasn't even supposed to be there in the crowd in the first place. But she'd heard that Jesus has some special power, that he's a mighty guy. And so, if she could just touch him, then here's that superstition, it's magic. If she can just touch his clothes, she'd get healed, and then she'd sneak back out of the crowd, and no one would be the wiser. And if Jesus had just healed her that way, and left her without saying anything to her, that thought would have been reinforced, right? that she would have been healed by magic. But Jesus wanted to use this physical healing as an opportunity to draw her to faith in him, which is why Jesus asks, "Who touched me?" It's not that Jesus was confused or something by some sudden power drain like some of the Jesus movies show it. Jesus knew who touched him, and he knew how she was healed, right? I mean, he's God. He doesn't need the information. But again, if the woman's to start to believe in him, and that's the longer-term cure that he's after, if the woman's to start to believe in him, Jesus needs to take the time to draw this woman deeper in rather than just let her fade away. And that's what he does. That's why he asked, "Who touched me?" To draw her out and draw her close, not only to heal her body, but to restore her soul. I mean, Jesus heals people who others can't. And Jesus heals things that others can't. In fact, he heals things that others can't even see. He even has the power to perceive people's thoughts and address them without being asked. So he addresses the need for spiritual healing here too. And once again, we see that Jesus is the mighty one. He's the mighty one who controls the uncontrollable, who defeats the undefeatable, and here who cleans the uncleanable. And you know what? You still ain't seen nothing yet.
While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus. Jairus was the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," the messenger said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe. She'll be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let everyone go in with him. He took only Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. During this time, all the people were crying and sobbing loudly over the child. "Stop crying," Jesus said. "She's not dead. She's sleeping." They laughed at him. They knew she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and right away she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were amazed, but Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened.
So talk about powerful. Who brings people back from the dead? I mean, there were two stories in the whole Old Testament about resurrections. If you want to look them up, 1 Kings chapter 17, the prophet Elijah raised the son of the widow of Zarephath. And 2 Kings chapter 4, the prophet Elisha raises the Shunammite woman's son. But that was it. The whole Old Testament and two isolated instances in thousands of years of history. And those guys, Elijah and Elisha, they've been dead and gone for something like 900 years. So the people in Jesus' day are thinking, well, those days, if they were even ever there, are long gone. Resurrections are over. I mean, they're rare to begin with, and now they're probably not ever going to return. And so when Jesus gets word, don't bother, you're too late, she's dead. And then he says, verse 50, I'm going to read it to you again, verse 50, "Don't be afraid, just believe, she will be healed." This is a dead girl he's talking about, right? She will be healed. And then he goes to the house anyway. He's taking on a hopeless and a lost cause. And when he says, "Get up and walk," and she gets up, and when he raises her from the dead, he ends up turning certain defeat into victory. This is like the exclamation point on this whole section in Luke chapter 8. And Jesus, the mighty one, makes death, which is the ultimate dead end, the ultimate closed door, the ultimate can't come back from an event. Jesus makes death something that people can be awakened from, like it's just sleep or something. I mean, the mighty one reminds me of something that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Death is swallowed up in victory. Think about that for a minute. Jesus, the mighty one, and the things that we've read about and talked about seeing him do. Before we go on in this conversation, I want you to pause and reflect for a minute and think about this. Which of those areas that we briefly looked at do you need to experience Jesus' mighty power in your life right now? Stilling a storm in your life or in your spirit? Releasing you from some demon that's plaguing you? Maybe a hurt, a habit, a hang-up, an addiction that you can't seem to overcome? Is it cleaning you up where you feel dirty? Is it giving you hope in something that looks and feels hopeless? Are you so overwhelmed on all sides that it's like all of the above right now? Just hit pause and spend a few minutes processing that. Talk about it with the people that you're watching or listening with, if you're watching or listening with someone, and then when you're ready, hit play again, and we'll talk to Jesus about that stuff. The world is a broken place, isn't it? And it's full of hurting and broken people. Maybe you're one of them. Or maybe you're not broken yet. You're just weak and weary and worn out, and you feel powerless to do anything about it. Hasn't always been that way, you know. In the beginning, when God made it, everything worked right, but the world's been that way it's been a mess for a really long time, like since the time that Adam and Eve decided to go their own way instead of following God's. Well, the point of these four stories, these four events, when seen as a unit, is that even though the world's a broken place, and you might find yourself in a broken condition, that you're not helpless. You're not helpless because Jesus is the mighty one. And he's here. And he can deal with anything that we face. Jesus has power over the things that scare us. Jesus has power over the things that assault us. Jesus has power over the things that control us. Jesus has power over the things that try to break us or destroy us. Jesus even has power over things like death that look like they can't be undone and that there's no coming back from. Right? We've seen that in these four events. Jesus has power over things that weaken us, power over things that weary us, power over things that beat us down year after year after year. And Jesus has power over things that we have absolutely no power to control. That's Jesus' track record. Right? He's the mighty one who can and does great things. And if Jesus did it before, he can do it again, right? I believe that. And if Jesus, the mighty one, is alive and well, he's here right now, right? Well, I believe that. But if that's so, then there's this question. Why is the stuff that makes me feel so weak and weary and worn out and broken and powerless, why is that stuff still there in my life? Why hasn't the mighty one exercised that same power here and now? and fix things, just like that, like he did in these events that we looked at today? The short answer, I don't know. It's way above my pay grade. I also don't know why God came up with the plan that he did to fix things and heal all the brokenness in the world. I mean, why doesn't he just do a remake right now? Instead of waiting until the end of time when Jesus comes back again. Now, I've got some idea that perhaps that has to do with the fact that God loves people, and that he's not willing to write anyone off, and that if he fixed things just like that, that would mean that a whole lot of people wouldn't be in heaven, and God didn't want that. So here's what I do know. That God's plan involved the mighty one, Jesus, becoming weak himself for a time, and becoming broken himself for a time, and helpless himself for a time, and powerless himself for a time, as he hung bleeding and dying on a cross, when he could have made all that go away just like that. Jesus stayed there, and he bled, and he died, and he paid the price for our sin because he loved us more than he loved his own life. And here's what the devil didn't see coming. What the devil didn't see coming is that in his weakness, Jesus would actually destroy the devil's strength. And that by his death on the cross, Jesus would destroy the power of sin and death and the devil to ruin our lives forever. The devil's pretty good at messing things up temporarily, but he has no power to hurt us permanently. The death and resurrection of Jesus saw to that. That was how God was reconciling the world to himself, not just people, but the whole world, reconciling it, healing it, putting it back together again through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And while that plan might not make sense to us, it is really good news for us. Good news because by his death and resurrection, Jesus makes forgiveness available to us right now. And forgiveness starts to heal a whole lot of the brokenness in our lives. Good news for us because by his coming back from the dead, Jesus demonstrated that he's mightier than sin and death and the power of the devil, and that he's alive and well and around to help us when we feel weak and worn out and weary and powerless. And good news, because the mighty things that we saw Jesus do in these events in Luke 8, and the mightier things that he did by dying on a cross and coming back to life again, that's also just a down payment on what's yet to come. See, while we're still dealing right now with all sorts of weakness and brokenness and messiness here in our world, there will come a day that we're not. There will come a day that everything is fixed. There will come a day when it's all put back together again, and the vision that God gives us in Revelation will come true, that there is no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. And we get to live and reign with Jesus forever. That's not this day. But while we wait for that day, and we're still dealing with the weakness and the brokenness and the powerlessness, remember what you've seen in these events. That Jesus is the mighty one. The mighty one who's here for you. He can deal with all that stuff. So lean into him. Ask him to help. And then trust his timing. We're going to talk about that a little more in the on-site message on Sunday. You can join us in person, or if you're part of our online-only community, the podcast of that will be up for you on Monday.